Welcome to this special edition of Liberty Dispatch, broadcasting across enemy lines into the Canadian culture war. Our show is produced by Liberty Coalition Canada in partnership with Christian Week. LCC exists to establish Christ's justice and righteousness and to defend those who stand. And Christian Week exists to provide a practical, balanced, hope-filled perspective on national and global issues. As always, you can reach out to us with questions, comments, concerns, criticisms at mailbag@libertycoalitioncanada.com. I trust that everyone in our audience is working hard in the vocation that God has called them to, whether that's in the home or outside the home. We're all working towards the advancement of God's kingdom. But now that you've saved some of your money, what's the best way for you to protect and grow your capital? Where do you go from here? Do you have a viable long-term plan? You may have some RSPs or TFSAs floating around, but are they working for you? I recommend that you call our friends over at Rocklinc. They'll help you with a financial plan that works for your family. They'll provide you with the necessary investment advice to make that plan become a reality. Exercise dominion in the realm of your financial planning and get connected with Rocklinc today. Plan wisely and invest biblically. Quote, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." Close quote. That's Proverbs chapter 21, verse 5. Call Rocklinc at 905-631-5462 or email them at info@rocklinc.com. That's Rocklinc with a C, info@rocklinc.com. I had the privilege recently of sitting down with law professor Bruce Pardy for a couple of hours earlier this summer to discuss issues of politics, morality, and the state, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Bruce is the executive director of Rights Probe and professor of law at Queen's University. A critic of legal progressivism and the liberal managerial state, he warned of dire consequences as soon as COVID lockdowns were imposed in spring 2020. He is one of the authors of the Free North Declaration, a call to arms to protect civil liberties from COVID irrationality and overreach. He has written on a range of subjects at the front lines of the culture war inside the law, including human rights and freedoms and free speech. He has taught at law schools in Canada, the United States, and New Zealand, practiced civil litigation, served as adjudicator and mediator on the Ontario Environmental Review Tribunal, and is senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. I'm sad to say that the last 30 minutes or so of our conversation did not make the recording due to the recording software freezing and the camera bugging out, but we still have a close to 2-hour discussion that we're going to show you. Both Bruce and I agreed that the last portion of our conversation, the one that didn't make it in, was very clarifying for our positions and very important for our current cultural climate. That's why I wanted to take a few minutes and describe what we discussed at the end so you don't miss anything. As you watch the discussion, you'll see very quickly that Bruce and I differ quite strongly on our beliefs about ultimate authority, the role of the state, and what kind of laws should govern a nation. Despite these differences, however, I'm very thankful for Bruce and for his voice over the past few years. He spoke out early and strongly about the state overreach and lawless mandates during the COVID era, and he's also been very clear about the dangers of woke progressivism for our Western culture. I've enjoyed every conversation I've had with Bruce, whether it's interviewing him on our show or having a coffee at Tim Hortons as friends. Bruce is one of the rare men in both higher education and the legal world who has been as bold and as clear as he has on the evils of our civil government and unelected bureaucrats. All of that is true, yet Bruce and I disagree about very important and very significant things. At the end of the day, we have different standards and justifications for our worldviews, and that affects our view of the state, its role, and the laws it should promote and enforce. As a follower of Jesus, that elevates the Word of God as supreme in its authority and flawlessness. I believe the state should function according to God-ordained design. As a libertarian, Bruce grounds his political ideology on a vastly different foundation. I appreciate that even though we differ on our opinions, we can still have conversations like this one and work together as much as possible for freedom and liberty in Canada. The two big concepts that came out toward the end of the conversation and which didn't make the recording are, first, how the state should make laws, and second, the ultimate incompatibility of what Bruce has called the liberty people and the virtue people. As to the first concept, Bruce believes that the state should only make laws punishing people who infringe on the freedom and autonomy of another person without their consent. Plain and simple. As a Bible believer, however, I believe the state has a duty to punish those who break God's laws and to legislate accordingly, which is what we ultimately see in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. As to the second concept, Bruce was clear that the Christians' desire to see God's law reflected in our legislation will be met with very strong opposition, as in, quote, everything in their power, close quote, kind of opposition. Conversely, the libertarian desire to have consent alone as the determining factor of lawmaking will also be met with opposition from Christians. But we will seek to bring change by having lots of kids / future voters, putting believers into elected office, and changing the minds and hearts of citizens through proclaiming the gospel and bringing about real spiritual and cultural change. Now, because both of our ultimate political goals and the means to achieve them are vastly different, the liberty people and the virtue people, to borrow Bruce's language, can only be co-belligerents for so long as we battle against the wokies and the Marxists. Bruce recognized something that I realized just after the convoy ended, and that is that those who reject God's ultimate authority will not be able to work together with those who embrace God's ultimate authority when it comes time to rebuilding culture and establishing laws. To be honest, I'm fine with that, and here's why. We can work together in limited capacities against the deadly ideologies that pervade our nation, such as statism, scientism, the managerial state, wokies, progressives, and so on. As I told Bruce in our discussion, because Christians are having, on average, significantly more children than non-Christians, and because we're increasingly not letting them be educated by state-funded indoctrination centers, in 1 to 2 generations, we will have the numbers necessary to elect righteous politicians and pass righteous laws. I'm fine with the long-term incompatibility of our worldviews because once the long-term becomes the short-term, I think we'll be all right. And that's really all I wanted to add to the conversation so that you don't miss anything. I want to say again that I'm not only very appreciative of the time Bruce gave me to have this conversation, but I'm thankful for Bruce and the work he does. By God's grace, he can continue to teach law and help students reject the evils that I've already mentioned, and then the church can reach them with the gospel and ensure that they do law upon the foundation of God's word. Enjoy. Well, so we last time we met, we were at Tim Hortons.
Yes.
And you just gotten off your bike. And
right.
I was sitting in a car for 4 hours or whatever.
Right.
And we had what I thought to be a really, really nice conversation that dovetailed off of a discussion that Matt and I had with you on our show.
Right.
And something that is an ongoing discussion, not just among people such as myself and yourself, but politicians, thinkers, ideologues. And it was when we're talking about kind of the laws and what should govern our nation, how should we structure things, how should we understand the law, apply the law, the rule of law, what are the foundations for that, the difference between the conservative versus libertarian versus whatever rainbow hair-colored system is currently in place.
Right.
And when we had that discussion, I found myself saying, and I said this to you, that this would be a really great discussion to have in more depth and probably record it specifically. Your mic is going down. Hold on.
It is good.
Right.
Okay, great. Carry on. Yeah.
So specifically to record it, I think because it'd be really good for people to listen in. And having discussions is good. I think one of the problems is a lack of discussion, a lack of dialogue, even within the camps.
Absolutely.
So not just between the camps, but even within the camps.
No question.
Even subgroups in the camps.
Yep.
It becomes a problem. Being in, the world of evangelicalism,
right.
Even the different stripes of evangelicalism disagreeing over what we're supposed to do and not do, and then not talking about it, has been a big problem. Right. So I thought it'd be good. And I guess the framing of it is, and I was actually talking with David Haskell on the phone a couple days ago, and both him and I to one another expressed our appreciation for you, your willingness to not only talk about these things, but you've been really helpful and our show helping us make sense of legislation and laws and kind of the history of where Canada's come from. So appreciative of the discussion, the fact that we are on this side of the freedom woke fight, as it were,
Right.
that we recognize that there's a great evil that is descending upon Canada at all levels.
Yes.
And so I thought I'm really thankful for you and for your input, your contribution to this discussion. I think I told you this when we met, that I stumbled upon an article you wrote for the National Post. And I'm like, who is this guy? And then I read down and, oh, he's a professor at Queen's.
Right.
And I was in Kingston and I thought, I got to reach out to this guy. I got to get a hold of this guy. And then I did. And at that point, you were already in London working with Rights Probe.
Right.
And then, so we move out somewhere this way, and then you're heading back.
That's right.
So I thought, okay, at least there will be something good in Kingston after we're gone. But I thought it'd be great to sit down and have this conversation, because once the year gets going, and then we're, formally 8 or 9 hours apart, it might be more difficult to do something like this. The timing's good. So
Great.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about what we were discussing and really help to flesh out the thinking, the worldview, kind of the presuppositions underneath it, to help even people understand what's going on and how to approach it.
Sure.
So I recently reread over your article from the Brownstone Institute, the Freedom, Virtue, Friends and Enemies. And then I also recently re-listened to the discussion you had with Jordan Peterson and Constantine, although he was just he was there taking it in, and then there'd be comments that were helpful,
Yes.
that he would interject, but it was really Jordan kind of gleaning from your understanding of the law and the history of where Canada's come from and where we are. So
Right.
I guess really briefly, as you can, what would be the distinction as you see between the freedom people and the virtue people? And then what is the conflict as you see it, both between those two groups, but more broadly, those two groups against foes, so to speak?
Right. So the so-called freedom people and virtue people are both together at this moment, because they both oppose a common thing, which is the woke, progressive, illiberal, authoritarian regime that has now come has become ascendant in our political culture, and you could see it most explicitly during COVID. Yes. And so those two groups, the virtue people and the freedom people, so-called, are of a mind about the fact that the rules that are being pressed down upon us are wrong. But those two groups, and I've just used those labels and we can talk about what those labels mean perhaps, but those two groups are very different in the way that they approach the question of, what ought to be. Right? Let's just start with the idea of freedom. Right? So the freedom people, so-called, are the classical liberals or the libertarians who believe that the most important thing is to be free, and they don't believe that there shouldn't be a state at all, but that the role of the state is to protect their freedom. In other words, to enforce a minimalist kind of law that would prevent violence, would prevent violation of property rights, would protect free speech, all those kinds of things. And the virtue people, for their part, believe that the state should be used to enforce virtuous behavior as they conceive it. And so if you, for a moment, just did a thought experiment and said, let's just take the woke people out of it, the leftist, progressive, authoritarian folks, let's just pretend that they don't exist and that there are just these two groups in society. And, for a good while in the political realm, there were just these two groups. There was sort of a over time, an uneasy back and forth tension between the conservative, which are the virtue people, and the classical liberal, which are the freedom people. And it was never purely one way or the other. But those were the two groups sort of competing in the political sphere. Now they're both they've both lost for the time being, and they're together. But if there were just those two groups today, then they would be in conflict.
Yes.
Right? They'd be in conflict because the freedom people would say, as long as you just have this minimalist kind of a proposition that we can't interfere with each other, then I can do whatever I want. I can interact with other people who consent with me to do whatever the two of us wish to do together in private. And the virtue people would say, no. We're going to have a set of rules that establish moral obligations. And even if you are carrying on in private, either on your own or with somebody else who consents, I'm sorry, there are certain things you just cannot do. And those two visions do not go together.
Yeah. And there's a gradation even in the second view.
Oh, of course.
Some people would say all morality, as they define it based on their moral system, must be legislated and enforced.
Yes.
And then there are others that would draw a line. So kind of what's known within at least Christian circles as kind of a theonomist position would be that we distinguish between crimes and sins. And some sins are crimes, like murder, but some sins are not crimes, like lust.
Okay.
So some virtue people would say, if you can prove that someone has sinned, then all the sins must be legislated, all of them.
Right.
And then some virtue people say only the categories of sins that are defined also as crimes are the ones that you legislate, and that would be a smaller list.
Right.
And then you would have some virtue people where the list would get even smaller, and they would say, the crimes, the whole sin-crime distinction is irrelevant, that we should probably have a legal system that's maybe based on or influenced by or takes its cues from, biblical principles, but not as strongly. So there's a variation of how much is actually legislated, but you're right that there's no... The agreement's not there, and I found this after the convoy was done. So leading up to the convoy,
sure, yeah.
I was quite literally standing beside other people as we're getting pushed out of the way and called all sorts of terrible things, and I think the dust kind of settles.
Yep.
And I had a number of people reach out to me saying, "Well, you're a Christian and a pastor, and you're actually in the fight for freedom. You're in protest. Maybe I need to rethink this whole Christianity thing. Maybe I want to come check out your church."
Right.
And inevitably, the first question these people would ask me, almost without exception, would be, "What's your stance on marriage? Like, what's your view on marriage?"
Right.
And we didn't get into a discussion about what should or shouldn't be legislated. They just simply said, "What's your church's position on marriage?" And I would say, well, I think that marriage has been made as an institution for one man and one woman in covenant for life.
Right.
And then the response from some people would be something to the effect of, well, you're just as bad as Justin Trudeau telling people what they can or can't do. And what I felt in the month of March of 2021 was, 2022, was what I called the freedom divide. It's within the broader freedom movement, there were these subcategories of people, and some are more, I would say, extreme than others. But these differences, these fault lines, if you will, these fissures under the ground, were a little more hidden when we were the object of scorn directly.
Right.
But now that that's subsided, now we're starting to see, if we're going to determine how we make laws, how we live, how we govern, we actually see things very differently.
Yeah. So let me see if I can draw some more lines, though, because so if you, I'm going to speak as a freedom person. So that reaction that you had about marriage is not one that I would have.
Right.
Right. So if I asked you, what your attitude in your church was towards marriage, and you told me that it was a union between a man and a woman, my reaction to that would be cool.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's your church and it's your life and it's your congregation, and you can decide on the values that you wish to promote, because the church is a private organization. It's not legislated. It is the stance that you've decided to take. And as far as I'm concerned, as a freedom person, you have the freedom to do that. I mean, people are not obligated to belong to your church. If they belong and they hear what they don't want and they want to leave and they can, then everything is cool. The reaction that you got suggests that they think that churches should not be allowed to adopt their own values. But those two views are still different from the virtue people, or at least a vein of them, right? Because they would say, no, marriage is only the union of a man and a woman, and nobody else out there is allowed to describe marriage in any other way but ours, and therefore we must legislate that to be the only way possible to have marriage. To a freedom person, that's not okay.
Yeah, and I guess the point in bringing that up was if there's a difference, if we put things aside, or if during the intensity of it, all that kind of falls to the backside because we're dealing with the threat right in front of us.
Sure.
Then when that subsides, if you start to see even just these ideological differences coming up, then obviously the next question is, so then how do we move forward? Because whatever current system we have is not really working.
Right.
We all agree something is really broken.
Agreed. Yeah.
And so if in the little way we see that divide, and I guess for me, I saw, okay, this is going to work itself out where these little fissures will become more pronounced as time goes on, especially where it appears we're in a time of reprieve for now.
Absolutely. And as if I can put it this way, as a side starts to succeed, that's when the fissures appear. That's when the conflict within the side start to grow. And so, whether we succeed in this long term or not, this is a good conversation to have because we really need to, if I can put it this way, to make peace within this persuasion so that we can carry on all together and try to work together to produce the kind of country and world that we approve of. So perhaps it would be interesting if you described to me, if you had your way, what would the world look like? How would it be ordered? What would the legislation say? What kinds of things would I not be allowed to do even if I wanted to?
Sure. So I would say that my answer would be something similar to maybe what we've seen in the past, or I would probably make the case that the kind of foundations that undergird both Canada, which is based in British common law, which has its ultimate beginning in something like the Magna Carta, reformational principles, or even the founders of the American Constitution. I think a lot of what drove their worldview, I would say, would be the sorts of things that would drive my worldview. So if I'll start at the very top, so God has created this world and this universe to function a certain way with certain laws and principles. You have laws of physics that you can't really contravene. You might be able to press against them, like when I jump up, gravity doesn't pull me down. But so you have laws of physics, you have laws of logic that are true mathematical laws, even economic laws, right? If you sow, you will reap. So there are all these laws, physically, logically, mathematically, in terms of governance, that the world works a certain way. And we see this play out when people either line their lives up to those laws. We tend to see historically a kind of flourishing and really a benefit and the most amount of freedom. So in the case of the family, for example, I would say, and I think that this would be borne out, that if you have a mom and dad in the home who don't leave and beat their kids, this will probably equal the best kind of life for the children. It would be best for them, and I think it'll be best as it works out broadly in the culture. Economic laws would be the same thing. If you spend more than you make, there's going to be a consequence to it. So if God's made the world to work a certain way, and then he's put certain institutions into place, like the state or the church or the family, these would all be institutions that he's created, that these institutions also have certain laws that are to govern them. Now, when I say laws, I'm distinguishing between, at least at this point, what is legislated by, the House and the Senate. So I'm talking about kind of laws that govern the way things are supposed to be according to how God has designed and commanded it to be. So you have these laws that govern, these prescriptions from God, and that the more a state, a family, or a church, or an individual, I think there's the reality of self-governance, the more that these different institutions or these different governments align themselves with the way God has designed them to be, that will equal the best outcome. It will equal the most freedom, prosperity, flourishing, blessing. That's my position. So what does that look like practically? So the question is, so when we look at the state, biblically, the role of the state is actually very simple. It is to punish those who do what is evil, so long as the evil is categorized, like I mentioned this previous category. Not all sins are crimes, but some sins are crimes, like murder would be an example of a crime. Stealing would be an example of a crime. So where you have God's law, where something is evil as he deems it evil, where it also falls into the category of crimes, that the state, their job is to punish those who break the law as it accords with God's law, and to reward, celebrate, honor those who keep the law as it accords with God's law. And then the second job of the state, or the third, I guess you could say, would be a kind of defense of borders and national security. There are surrounding nations, borders are biblical as well. So the job of the state is very minimal. So in terms of what would you not be allowed to do, that you might be able to do now, would be any of the crimes, the sins/crimes that God says this is where a state should step in and punish, where there's a victim, then that is to be punished. So murder would be the clearest one. So what would you not be allowed to do now? Well, I don't know. What is currently, I mean, you can do anything now, so.
Obviously, this is very interesting. You say we can do anything now, but see, my perspective would be that that's a lot of things you can't do now. Right? Right?
Sure, yeah.
So here's the possibility. We should drill down here a little bit, because it's possible. I think it's probably not likely, but it's possible that it just so happens that worldview that you've just described might happen to line up with the kinds of things that I think ought to be restricted.
I think there's I think there'd be a lot of overlap.
Right? So you mentioned murder, you mentioned theft. Like, I agree with you that those two things ought to be unlawful for a different reason, because you're interfering with somebody else. It's somebody else's freedom. Somebody else has the freedom to live. You can't take their life away. They have property rights. You can't steal their car. It's not because they're sins. It's because you are interfering with somebody else. But I suspect that there are some things that you would restrict that I would not. So let's just see if there are some. If not, then we're all on the same page.
Yeah. So like,
right?
Doctor-assisted murder.
Right.
I would restrict.
Okay.
But I would restrict it on the same grounds that I would restrict murder, because murder, I think, defined would be the intentional taking of innocent human life. That's how I would define murder, the intentional taking of innocent human life.
Right.
So self-murder.
Yes. Well, before we get to physician-assisted,
sure,
let's just talk about suicide.
Yeah.
Okay. So, am I allowed to kill myself?
What do you mean by are you allowed?
I mean, are you going, in your world, are you going to have legislation that says killing yourself or attempting to kill yourself is an offense?
Attempting to murder
myself.
Attempting to murder would be attempted murder, and attempted murder brings with it whatever.
Okay, but just to be clear, though, you are lumping suicide in with murder.
Yes.
Right.
As I would define murder, which I think would be murder again is the intentional taking of innocent human life.
Right.
And I think one of the differences, and this would maybe be a high level difference in terms of how these things play out, would be the authority over one's own life.
Yes. Right.
Is a huge issue.
Yes.
So I think that the libertarian or the freedom people, as you would define it.
Yes.
So I think I would categorize myself as freedom, and I think that one of the things in the article is when we get into the definition of what freedom is, who defines it, and who gets to kind of hold the rule book, if you will, for what freedom is.
Yes.
So the authority over this is why I laid out the worldview that I did.
Yeah.
That because God has made the world to operate a certain way, as creator, he ultimately has the highest authority over everything and over every institution.
Yes.
So one of the reasons why you had churches, not many, but churches that stood against the lawless and unscientific mandates of the federal, provincial, and municipal governments during COVID wasn't because they said you are infringing on my freedom.
Right.
That actually wasn't
Right.
the thrust of the argument.
Right.
The thrust of the argument is you do not have jurisdictional authority in these matters because this authority has not been given to you by God, who's instituted an authority. So God has instituted a certain level of authority for the state in terms of what they can and can't do. So one of the things the state is not allowed to do, as authority has been given to them by God to do so, is to deal in the realm of public health, for example. That is outside of their jurisdictional authority.
Okay, but do you, okay, well, let's just drill down on that a little bit, though. Does that mean that you disagree with the power of the state to send inspectors to restaurants to see if there are rats in the kitchen?
They can send inspectors to say if there are rats in the kitchen.
Yes.
And they can let everyone know there are rats in the kitchen.
Yeah.
But if a person continues to keep their restaurant open with rats in the kitchen,
Yeah.
and everyone knows that there are rats in the kitchen,
Yeah.
then chances are people will not continue to go there if they knew. And if they did, they'll suffer the business consequences for it.
Well, okay, but let's just challenge that a little bit. So they have the right to force themselves into the property owned by the restaurant owner?
Yeah, no. I don't think they have the right to force themselves in. But I would say if they say we're here to inspect, can we inspect the premises?
Right, and let's say the owner says no.
Yeah, no, then you can't.
Okay, so the answer is no. You don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so how about
it'd be a willful inspection?
Oh, if you
not a forced one.
But if the owner gives consent, then anything is possible, right? I mean that's from my playbook.
Yeah.
If you have consent, everything is fine.
So fire codes, issues of fire codes,
sure.
That is completely outside of the state's jurisdiction.
Okay, how about
how far apart your studs need to be? Outside of their jurisdiction.
How about a rule that says that in retail establishments people must wear a shirt and shoes?
No, the state can't enforce that.
Okay. So what is it that makes public health out of bounds, and yet so many other things not?
Yeah, so the qualification being the authority that the state has been given is to punish those who do evil by breaking laws where there is a victim.
Right.
So a crime. That's what puts something into the realm of crime.
Okay. So
where there's the victim.
That's good, but hold on. But define victim for me. So let me give you a situation.
Sure.
Let's say that two people are involved in a fight, and during the course of the fight, one of them knocks the other one out. Mm-hmm. Is there a victim?
One of them knocks the other one out?
Yes.
Well, so in this system, both of the men for their assault are both to be found guilty of assault. So the consequences could be, so if two men are fighting, right, and it's not one's defending themselves, but two men are standing on the sidewalk and say, let's start fighting right now. Okay,
right.
Let's start fighting right now.
Right.
And then they start fighting.
Yes.
If one accidentally murders the other, obviously there's a great...
Well, forget the murder.
If they're both fighting,
let's not worry about the murder.
They both assaulted one another.
Okay, but even though, I mean, as you described, they stood there on the sidewalk and they said, let's fight. In other words, they agreed to fight. They consented to fighting. Even though they have consented, they have still committed a crime?
Yep.
What if the two of them are in a boxing ring?
So if they're in a boxing ring, some people would disagree with that. Some people would say, no, any of this kind of senseless violence, we should also not have to do with it.
Right.
I think what would distinguish it in sport, for example, would be, so why are the two guys, maybe I'll ask a question, why are they fighting? Or they just say, hey, let's just start.
But who cares? Why?
Well, I think intent matters.
But let's say you're a boxer, and you're a boxer because you're filled with hate, and you just like slugging people. So you take on a career as a boxer, and you get into a ring, and every time you get into a ring, the other guy says, sure. But your motivation is the same. Mm-hmm. What's the difference?
Well, the difference would be some of the circumstances around the two situations. So there are going to be sports, for example, by nature that will have a violent aspect to them by nature of the sport. There's going to be a combat.
Yes.
And even in in the scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, you have examples of sport where there's wrestling, where the nature of wrestling is going to be
Sure.
the exertion of strength
Right.
one over another.
Right.
If the two guys, and maybe I should have asked to qualify this question, if the two guys standing outside are saying, "Hey, we're fighting to train to spar, that we're not seeking to do harm beyond this," like I want to.
But the two guys in the boxing ring are seeking to knock each other out.
Sure.
Right.
So part of the reality of the world that we live in is that there are going to be certain structures in place. So with the boxing, for example, where if we say, okay, we understand what we're doing here. We understand that this is a boxing match. It's a sport. There's a matter of regulation. We've agreed on these things. We've agreed to a series of rules. You can't, no low blows, whatever like that. If we've created that and we've agreed to it, in that instance, the person's intent, we can't necessarily judge their heart. We can't judge their heart and know what their motives are. We can't engage in thought crimes.
Right.
So we can't do that.
No.
But we can look at what we see on the surface of it and judge it based on that.
This seems to be a very thin distinction that we're trolling on now.
Now we err on the side of.
So, but if you're in a park, you've talked about structures because you're in a ring and there's a league and there's an umpire, but that's often not the case with sport. In sports, sort of original or organic form, there's no such thing. Let's say there's a rugby match in the park. There's no referee, there's no league. It's just a bunch of guys saying, let's play rugby. And rugby is a brutal game, right? There's tackling, there's injuries, but they all agree that they're going to play. That's not going to be an offense, is it?
No.
Well, then what's the distinction between two people agreeing to do X and two people agreeing to do Y?
If what they agree upon is something that is prohibited, or if what they agree upon...
Yeah, but tackling somebody in the middle of the field is prohibited unless you consent. My point is this, that the rules that protect victims are rules that prohibit behavior against that person unless the person consents, is my point. If you have consent for the rugby, for the boxing, for the sex, for whatever it is, then there's no victim. And if I decide to kill myself, I am not a victim because I'm the one who's acting and I have my own consent, is my point.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that's if at the top of the list is consent, then okay. Then
my world operates on consent.
Right. So
the only difference between us are those situations in which you're going to prohibit something in a situation where there is consent upon all the parties involved, whether it's suicide, whether it's prostitution, whether it's pornography, all those things. If you have actual consent, then in my world, you can do whatever you want because you're not imposing upon anybody.
So the question then is, the question underneath that would be, because yes, I agree that the difference would be a matter of, is consent enough that something should or should not be prohibited?
Right.
And I think the question underneath that would be one of authority, like I've mentioned, that who is it ultimately that has supreme authority over one's life? Is thinking as well.
Yeah.
Who has supreme authority over one's life and actions?
Right.
That who has the authority to say this is or is not allowed?
Yes.
So that would be another area of difference.
Okay, but I want to make sure I understand that though. So that presumes though that people do not have the authority to consent on their own behalf unless, I'm not sure what the unless is.
So it's not that they don't have the authority to consent. They do have the authority, or they have the ability to consent.
Yes.
But the question is, even if they consent to said activity, is there still a prohibition against it?
Yes.
Because ultimately, the authority to determine what they can or can't do, or what ventures into the realm of the line between sins and crimes, if they get to define that, or whoever the body gets to define it, that's the question: is who holds the rule book?
Okay, so back to the question though. So what am I not allowed to consent to?
That should be legislated against.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, I would say doctor-assisted murder / suicide.
Okay, so
I would say that.
So is that different from just plain old suicide? If I kill myself, it's okay, but if a doctor can't help me?
Oh, no, yeah, I would include that as well.
Okay, but that swings me back into the consent question that we went through, though. So if I'm doing it to myself, if I'm consenting, then why am I not allowed to do it?
Because ultimately, the individual is not the one who has the highest authority over their life to determine what they can or can't do with their life and with their body. That there's a higher authority that has created the person, the world, the system, the institutions of self, family, church, and state government that says,
Yeah.
there we go.
There we go.
That determines whether or not an action is lawful.
Okay, so let me paint this from the perspective of a freedom person, what you've just said. What that means is that you would like to use the authority of the state. And I know you're attributing it to God. But the force is being imposed by the state. And so what I think you wish to do is to use that authority of the state to define and to determine what other people are allowed and not allowed to do. The explanation that you give is God, but the tool is the state. And the problem is that not everybody agrees about what God's law is. And so if you are determined to take your interpretation of that and put it into legislation, then that is simply an insistence that your view of God's law is the one that shall prevail. And that, in my view, and David and I spoke about this too, that makes the virtue people the violent people, because that's what legislation is. It is state violence to impose a code.
Yeah. So the Bible in Romans 13 says that the state has been given the sword.
Yes.
To execute justice.
Right.
And that looks like punishing the one who breaks the law.
Sure.
Rewarding the one who, which is unavoidable in any system.
Well,
the
sure,
yes. The state wielding the sword.
It's the paradox of law in this sense. For a freedom person, here's the paradox. In order to have freedom that is protected by the state, the sword has to have a sword with which to beat back the violations of freedom imposed by some people upon others. Okay, that's fine. But the irony is this, that the freedom people are insisting upon the freedom of the virtue people to live as they wish. And so people come into your congregation, into your church, and they hear you say religion is between a man, marriage is between a man and a woman. And some freedom people might not agree with that idea, but it doesn't matter to them because they're not about to impose their views about what's right and wrong upon your church. So in a regime run by freedom people, your church can believe anything it wants and proselytize any way it wants and to set any kind of rules it wants for its own congregation. But if the virtue people were in charge, then there are a lot of things that the freedom people might believe in that they would not be allowed to do. And so from the point of view of freedom people, the virtue people are tyrants.
And so I can understand that perspective.
Yeah.
That the virtue people are tyrants. And I would qualify it, and maybe yourself, or I'm sure others might think, well, Andrew, that's a convenient way to offload some responsibility.
Sure.
Which, I'll receive that, except for the fact that God does exist and he has created the world to work a certain way. So
Right,
whatever, you
right.
can get mad at gravity all you want, but gravity's gravity. You can't call gravity a tyrant for holding you to the ground. It holds you there because that's how the world works.
Sure, but you don't need legislation to impose gravity. This is a distinction, right? There are some things out there in the world that you experience just because you're alive, and gravity is one of them, right? And the source of gravity, we can talk about that and agree or disagree about it, but it exists, and you can't get free of it, no matter what you do. You can't legislate it away, and you don't need to legislate it for it to be imposed, right? There are lots of other things that are not that way.
Yeah.
Right.
So the question then, so I guess some of the questions underneath would be a question like, what is the role of the state?
Yes.
Who gets to determine the role of the state?
Absolutely.
So let me.
Right.
I'll kind of. So I'm the Christian nationalist boogeyman, but as I define it, so I think Christian nationalism can be wielded as a weapon. But when I say Christian nationalist, I simply mean that I think our system of laws and governance should be based upon biblical foundations.
Right. So what do you say to those people who don't believe in the Bible?
I would say to them that whenever you have a nation or a culture that is built upon biblical principles, well, sorry, before that, let's rewind. What would I say to the person that doesn't believe? I would say to them, whether or not you believe in biblical principles, you're free to believe or not believe. But
they're not. They're not.
they're free. Sorry, they're free at least to say, I don't think that God exists.
Sure.
You can say God doesn't exist.
Okay.
That's fine. But he does exist.
Sure. Well. Okay. Sure.
Sure.
I mean,
so he does. And
but here's the thing, though. See, I might agree with you about that, but my agreement with you doesn't make me right or you right. In other words, you still have to confront the problem that people in society are going to disagree about fundamental things. And as soon as we cross the threshold of insisting that what we believe is the truth, and listen, I am not criticizing in any way the conviction that what you're saying is true. I respect that conviction. But having a conviction is not a sufficient justification for imposing that conviction upon other people. Because everybody else could do the same thing. That is what the woke is doing. The woke have a conviction that certain things are right, like vaccines for COVID, like non-gender pronouns. I mean, some of them are absolutely, positively, 100% sure that that is the right thing to do, and therefore you will do it. And my objection is, you can't decide that for me. That's not up to you. It's up to me. And so I would say the same thing to you. That's not up to you. It's up to you to decide what your own convictions are. And I leave that to you. But you can't turn around and then impose those convictions on me because I'm an equal person to you.
So I would say it's also not up to me. Now, this is where the disagreement would come. I would say it's also not up to me that I'm not the one who gets to make the rules, and I'm not the one who does make the rules.
Well, hold on. But by rules, which rules do you mean now? Because you established two categories of rules, right? God's laws and the laws.
So
right?
the laws, I think, need to be based upon
I know you think that.
God's laws, right?
But that's just an opinion.
Well, I don't think it's an opinion.
Right. But this, now we're getting to the core of it, right? Because there is an insistence. So here's the problem. I alluded to it a minute ago, but let me say it again. The problem is, Oliver Wendell Holmes, judge of the U.S. Supreme Court, famously said, certitude is not the test for certainty. Just because you're sure about something doesn't mean it's true. And I accept that you're sure. And a lot of other people are sure, too, about similar things. That does not matter one whit. To me, if I don't agree, then I don't agree. And the only way to have that truth, your truth, imposed upon me is with violence. And what I'm really getting at is it really, well, let me put the question another way. Are you saying that the core of the Christian belief is the use of violence to impose its terms?
No. That the state has been given a certain mandate by God
Yeah, but see, that's
and they're required
that's a
to
Christian
fulfill
belief.
that mandate.
That's a Christian belief. You're
Well-
you're imposing the mandate. So let's
let's Christian belief aside. Then,
Yeah.
what we need to deal with is the issue of how to account for the worldview, values, or presuppositions.
Okay.
So let's put the Christian belief aside for a second.
okay.
The system that's being proposed, the freedom people system,
Yeah.
that the state is only required to intervene when consent, only to intervene when their consent is being violated.
Right.
Okay. So the question then is, why that?
Okay. Well, I'll answer that question this way. There are really only two choices for my money. There's that, or there's no rules at all. There's violence. And I'm not making a moral case for one or the other. I prefer the situation in which we are all free and the state protects our freedom. I prefer that. It's just a preference. If you want to choose the violent one, I'm not going to argue about it morally. I'm just saying that's not a great choice.
So other than preference, though,
Yeah, exactly.
other than preference,
There is nothing else.
Okay, so that is an exceedingly not, I wouldn't say dangerous proposition. That's not the word I want to use.
Yep.
I think that is ultimately not illogical, because it's logical.
Yes.
It flows. The argument flows logically.
Yes.
The problem with it, or the problems with it, would be if it's based merely on preference, then why should your preference win over my preference?
Well, granted, absolutely.
Yeah,
But
because that
But here-
ultimately makes you
here's the reason why.
not about the tyrant, but ultimately something has to be enforced.
Well, sure, but
So
here,
why one's preference over another?
right? I with that basic proposition, I agree.
So then none of us are freedom people.
Well,
At the end of it, if we take it to the end of the argument,
sure.
everyone has to appeal to some sort of authority to say, here's the authority. And if the authority's preference,
I don't think so. Well,
Yeah.
but here's the difference between your approach and mine. So if you accept my proposition that everything's a preference, then and that means you can choose whatever you want to, or you can prefer anything you want to. But my approach acknowledges that reality. In other words, if everything's a preference, then my system is the one that allows everybody to make their own preferences.
why is that preferable?
Yeah, but exactly so. Exactly so. That's a preference. I acknowledge that. But as I'm saying, you're here are the two choices again. And I'm asking you to choose between them. And I'm asking you this because the other choice is one that people don't want to pick.
Yeah,
Right?
anarchy.
The anarchy.
Yeah.
It's because the anarchy is the free-for-all. The anarchy is the one in which there are no rules saying we're all free.
Yeah.
There's just no rules. And the powerful can do whatever they can with violence. And I'm saying, when you come right down to it, there are only those two choices. And any choice that does not recognize the freedom of the individual to pursue their own preferences is a choice to impose violence. So,
Which is unavoidable. The
well,
imposition of violence, because if so why? So again, the question would be, philosophically,
yeah,
why does consent matter? Like, let's just
sure.
why does consent even matter?
Right.
Why should that be the line that we draw? Right.
Well,
let's get underneath.
right.
It. Why does
Okay,
consent?
so let me-
why should the state even step in matters of consent?
I agreed.
Or another question, a sub question would be,
Yeah.
why does consent begin at the age of 17 or 16?
Well, let's say,
14?
let's say,
I just don't do-
of
like,
course,
the definitions. How do we account for
absolutely.
the consent being
Sure.
what's preferred?
Sure. So let me try this proposition. Let's say I come along and I say, I'm going to propose that we have this one rule. And of course, the one rule has all other kinds of corollaries and consequences. If I say, people are not allowed to impose force against you, then all of those rules that we talked about, murder and theft and assault and so on, are unlawful because of the basic proposition. Okay. But I come along and say this, and I say to you or anybody, I say, do you agree? Do you want a world in which violence is prohibited or not? What's your preference? Okay. Those people who agree say, that's my preference too. I want to have a world in which we have this principle. I mean, that's fine because they've all agreed to it. there are going to be some people who say, no, that's not my preference. I want a world in which anything goes. There's a free-for-all, and might is right. Okay, so to those people I say, okay, all right. Well, here's how it's going to work then. We're going to have a state, because we already have a state, and that state is going to use its force to impose this principle that I described. And you just told me that you believe that might is right. Well, I have a state that has might, and they are opposing that rule with their might. You can fight it if you can. If you can't, then you lose. According to your own rules, your own preference was might is right. I have a state. The state is might, therefore the might is right. So therefore my rule, my one principle that says you can't impose force upon other people is agreed to by the people who want it, and agreed to in a very strange opposite way by all those people who say no, because then I have free reign to impose the state's might on those people and enforce the rule. There is nobody.
Well, what if those people in that second category
Yes.
say something like, my might?
They want to hedge their bets. But you see, when you say my might, you are saying might. You can't split hairs that way.
Why not?
Well,
Why can't they?
Well, because if you are stating your preference for your own might, there is no reason on earth why anybody should go along with that preference and use their own might against you.
Why not?
Because they can.
No, but if the person says, we consent, this large group of the population
Yes.
says that our consent is
Yes.
that the individual,
Yes. Yes.
without legislative power,
Yes.
has the freedom to impose their might on others.
Yes.
But the idea of the
but-
ideas of laws or a legislative system being imposed upon us, we reject that. We don't
Right.
like that. We don't
But
like that premise.
But the situation that I described, here's the thing that distinguishes my sequence that I just described to you to any other, including the one you just described. My question, do you prefer a world in which force is prohibited or not? Whether you say yes or whether you say no, you have universal agreement to the idea of the state imposing that rule with force. Because one group has said yes, and one group has said might is right. In any other situation like the one you described, you do not have universal agreement. And those people who do not agree have no reason to go along, because you're inviting a might is right situation.
So then it's the universal agreement of the people that ultimately determines the system.
I'm describing a situation where I have a plan, and my plan was to impose this rule. If you're in a might is right situation, then anything goes. Anything goes. If you're in a might is right situation, you cannot say, well, this kind of might is okay and this kind of might is not okay, because you're going to have fights about it. If you want a world that's peaceful, and that's a preference too, maybe people don't want that. But if that's what you want, then for my money, the only way to achieve that is with the principle that I'm describing.
So would that also apply to, because I think it was in the interview with Jordan Peterson where you talked about threats.
Yes.
Where no actual violence has been done.
Yes.
Should threats be
where
force hasn't been exhibited?
The threat of imminent violence, for my money, is the use of violence, because you are compelling behavior on the basis of the violence that is to come.
But not the violence that actually did happen, though.
So if I walked up to you on the sidewalk and I say, give me your wallet, or I'll stab you with the knife I have in my pocket, that's violence.
Well, not in the traditional definition of violence.
Not in the doing of it, but in the issuing of the threat, in order to compel you to give me your wallet. I mean, you are being coerced to behave in a way that you wouldn't ordinarily behave because of the promise of the violence. That is using force to create your behavior.
But it's not really using force.
Well, it's not using force itself, but it's using the promise of force. In other words,
Yeah.
it is establishing an equation that goes like this: you will do as I demand, or I will impose force against you. And therefore, we cannot describe your action of giving me your wallet as an action of free will.
Well, it is, and that ultimately the choice is between whether I decide what will happen if I don't.
Well, you can do that for any action.
Right.
Any action in the world. And the line that I am drawing, and it is typically drawn, but you can disagree with it. The line I'm drawing is between actions that weigh up consequences. Like, for example, let's say you have no job, you're hard up, you have no education, you have no skills, and you go to get a job, and the job that you find is a terrible job. It's a job you don't want to do. You're cleaning washrooms or sweeping floors. You don't want to do it. And you say, well, I'm being compelled to do this job. I don't want to do it. My employer is coercing me into doing this job. Well, the answer to that is no. Your employer is not coercing you,
right,
because you came to the employer asking for a job. You have no other choices, but the employer is not going to beat you if you don't do the job. If you don't want it, you can just walk away. That's being free. Even though your choices are terrible, that's being free. But if the employer said, and yeah, you'll take this job, and if you walk away, I'll send my thugs after you to beat you up. Okay, now you're being coerced. That's coercion. That's the definition of coercion.
But at present, the person has not had their autonomy violated.
The violence hasn't happened yet. But
right,
if you show up to work every day to do this terrible job, solely on the basis that the employer has said, we are going to beat you to death if you don't do this, then you are not deciding of your own free will to do the job.
So then where the state steps in this system would be not only when a person has their actual freedoms violated, but when the threat of violating freedoms is present.
When
like what
the
if it's
threat,
what if it's if you don't give me your wallet, I'm going to drain your bank account. I'm going to hack into your bank account.
Well, see,
now that's not assault, but that's theft.
Sure. Well, we can
going to.
Well, I mean, there might be a good argument for that. Let me see if I can make it. So, if the proposition is that you can't use violence, so let me step back a bit. Sometimes people ask, well, but if I take your bike, that's not violent. I mean, the bike's over there, you're over here. I didn't impose any violence upon you. I just took your bike. Well, no, it's the same thing. I mean, if we have a proposition that you're not allowed to use violence, and you can't take stuff that other people own, and why is that? Well, because if I had the bike in my hands, as I am allowed to do, because it's my bike, in order for you to get the bike, you have to yank it out of my hands. That's violence. And so we can also say that if you have a contract to buy the bike, then that is the reason you can take the bike. And if you break the contract, so let's say I go to you, you have an old bike and I want to buy it. You say $200 for the bike and I agree. And I say, I'll take the bike now and I'll come back tomorrow and I'll pay you the $200. So I take the bike. And I've taken the bike pursuant to the contract, which means that you've given consent. So when I take the bike pursuant to our contract, that's not violence. It's not theft. But next day, I see you in the street and say, oh, by the way, I'm not going to pay you. Okay? I've breached the contract. Now we can say, oh, well, actually, the consent that you gave for me to take the bike is now vitiated. It's gone because it was given on the basis of the deal that we made, and I've broken the deal. So therefore, I've stolen the bike, and I've broken the principle that there's going to be no force because I've taken the bike with force. Okay? Even though there's no actual force that we could see. If you looked at all the actions, there was no beating, there was no violence. But threats are the same kind of thing. You are violating the idea of consent.
So, but could it be threats for anything? So, let's use a bike analogy.
Right.
If you don't give me,
Yes.
if you don't give me your wallet, I'm going to steal your bike.
Right. So that's where I was going. So that's the basis on which to make this argument. That if I threaten to drain your bank account, as you said, or to steal your bike, or in some other way to destroy your property. So let's say I come and say, if you don't do X tomorrow, I'm going to blow up your house. Yeah, that's the threat of force. Sure.
But it seems to be, it doesn't seem to be consistent though. And by that, I mean, let's assume I make the threat to blow up your house.
Yeah.
And then you don't do what I asked you to do.
Yes.
And then I was bluffing.
Right? Oh yeah, sure.
I was bluffing.
Sure.
Or I changed my mind. I'm like, you know what? Actually not a good idea.
Right.
So there we go. So if the only prerequisite for the state intervening
Yes.
is when a person's autonomy is violated,
Yes.
right? Then until the autonomy has been violated, the threat of it is still abstract, in that the person might not necessarily, if we could guarantee the person was going to go through with it, but if the person was lying, let's say they were actually lying,
Sure.
then isn't that kind of pre-crime-ish? Like, it seems like we have two categories now, where on the one, it's actual imposition of a person's autonomy and freedom by actually imposing force, not the threat of, but the actual imposition of force, so that where there's no consent.
Sure.
But that's a different category than threats.
Oh, I agree that it's
guarantee. So that would mean that that would be one other job of the
perhaps.
state, the real actual threat, and then the force of or the threat of force, the real force and the threat of the force, which they may or may not act on.
You could make this case. Sure. I'm open to it. I'm inclined not to think so, but and one reason for that is that you're describing it, and not unreasonably, as two different categories of things. Fair enough. But when we talk about the use of force, people think of things that are, really violent, like people beating each other up or shooting them, and so, or blowing houses up. Okay, but this is also a degree of well, I don't want to call it gray, because there's definitely a line. But so if someone comes up to you and puts their hand on your shoulder, usually that's going to be okay, because that's the nature of interactions. Let's say you're, at a restaurant, a friend comes up to you, to your chair, and puts their hand. I mean, no problem. Why? Because you've impliedly consented to that, even though you didn't know that they were there. But if you're in a crowded place and you say to somebody, "Please don't touch me," and they touch you anyway, well, that's violence. That because they touched you without consent.
Yep.
Right? So I wouldn't call that violence in that normal sense, but it is violence for the purpose of our principle. And so when you are threatening violence, I'm inclined to lump that in with the use of violence to get your way. But you can argue the reverse.
Well, I think I think it is at the very least it would be a different category in terms of actual and potential. Let's say.
Okay.
Actual and potential. That
Okay.
we have to distinguish between the two.
The core of both, though, is common in the sense that what we're ultimately trying to prevent is coercion. Right? You're trying to prevent some people from making other people do things they don't want to do. And so if we regard threats of force in that way, we could do, let's imagine a social experiment. If we said suddenly, okay, the only thing prohibited is actual force, not threats of force or any other thing, we could see how that goes, because it might be that
interestingly enough, some camps,
yeah,
so some camps of Christian thinkers
yeah,
would say that the only things that can be punished are things where there is an actual in real time victim. So there are camps of Christians, for example, who would say, if you're driving 200 in a school zone,
sure,
unless you hit someone,
sure,
and then then you're liable.
sure.
Whereas others would say that's negligence, and the risk, because the risk is so great and there's a genuine concern that it's irresponsible. So let's use that example.
Okay.
Doing 200 in a school zone.
Right.
Is that something where the state should step in and say, we're punishing you for this?
Yeah.
Because in that instance, there's no victim. There's no victim.
Right.
They've not made a threat to anyone.
Right.
There might be negligence, but negligence would be a third category.
Well, you can't sue a negligence unless you cause an injury.
Yeah. So if someone's doing 200 in a 40 zone,
right,
would you say okay?
Well, see, this is a good example of why I think that roads should be private. Because if roads are private, then the owner of the road can determine what the rules are. And if you have a private road leading to a private school, and the owner of the school and the road both say that the speed limit on this road is going to be 40, and you drive 200, well, the owner of the road can then say, get off my property.
So that's an interesting proposition, because they're not saying you can't be on my property, but they're saying you can't go a certain speed when you're on my property.
Well, but it's the same thing as being in your living room. So you can decide who gets to be there, and you can decide what they can do when they're there. So both of those kinds of rights.
Well, yes and no. I think if someone's in my living room and they start singing, I don't think that would be grounds for me calling the police if I say, hey, please don't. I could ask them to leave my house.
That's what I mean.
And if they don't leave,
that's what I mean.
And
you can do that for any reason you want. If they start singing and you don't like it, you can ask them first to stop singing.
Yes.
And then when they won't, you can say, well, please stop or leave. And then if they won't leave, then
the private road is 40 and some guy just burns through it doing 200 without an opportunity to be told not to.
Well, but hold on. But
they know beforehand that's already the rule's been established.
That constitutes a trespass.
Okay.
Right?
So then when you say roads private, do you mean like all roads, main roads, highways?
All roads.
Everything.
Everything. I don't think we should have public institutions. I think we should have a very small state that's enforcing one rule and one rule only.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that so when I think about where the civil government has all of its little tentacles, I would agree that healthcare, media, economics, academia, get out.
Yeah.
The only time the state is allowed to step in is where an actual crime has been committed in those spheres. Or if someone in the world of economy, if someone clearly defrauds someone or steals from someone in the business realm, right?
Sure.
So the same thing with the family. I think that there's jurisdiction of the family.
Yeah, but you see, okay, but my problem with that is that you are being very absolute, and I like it, in terms of getting the state out of situations, not giving the state the ability to make judgments about how people have behaved, because the whole thing is private. Except you're tacking on exceptions. So the roads are private.
Where they have been given jurisdiction.
But hold on. The roads are private, but marriage is not private. Come on, marriage is a deal between two people. How can that not be a private transaction?
Because marriage as an institution, what marriage is.
Yeah.
So my position would be that marriage is an institution with a historically understood definition. So I'm very big on not handing over the dictionary.
Yeah, but this is very
to others. But in the case of marriage, I would say that marriage understood historically.
Yes.
If someone wants to call it a civil union, then pursue a civil union. If you want to go to the justice of the peace, pursue your civil union. But the idea of marriage as an institution would be something that is, again, back to the question of authority.
Yeah.
It's something created and defined purposefully with an intent by God to function a certain way. So outside of that, it's not marriage.
So can I shift tracks just a little bit and ask you a couple of questions from a Christian perspective?
Sure.
Right? Because I haven't been proceeding from that perspective up until now. So. And I'm not a scholar of the Bible or anything of that nature, but it seems to be, it strikes me as a strange. Let me just ask the question. God rules. God rules always, everywhere. Now, why does he need the state?
Why does he need the state?
Why does he need the state to do the ruling that he's already doing?
So God has instituted the state in order to govern the affairs of people who exist in cities and provinces and countries that you have that God through humans.
Yes.
Right. So the way that God has chosen to operate is not through someone breaks a law, he strikes them with lightning. The way that God has chosen to operate through human beings is through institutions.
But this strikes me as quite different than the arguments that Jesus made. Jesus did not have a state to impose his ideas. He didn't seek one. He didn't seek to impose his ideas with force. Mm-hmm. He didn't say, you must do this. He said, consider this. When he interacted with the prostitute, he didn't say, you should be thrown in jail. He said, I forgive your sins, and sent her away.
Well, but he did make a claim that the stoning of that woman would be appropriate if a sinless person were to present themselves. There's a part of a proposition where Jesus was clear that there is that the death penalty for adultery in Old Testament Israel.
Yes.
That there's a penalty for adultery. So Jesus didn't say there's no penalty. So first of all,
Yep.
I don't think that's actually in the Gospel of John. I think there's an issue to be made about manuscript evidence. But aside, let's assume that John actually wrote John 7:53 to 8:10, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Yes.
When Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone,"
Yes.
Jesus is not saying
Right.
that the death penalty is not appropriate.
Okay.
He's saying
Okay.
execute her,
Right.
right, as an individual.
Yes.
If you're sinless.
So that
For the individual, but I don't advocate for vigilante justice.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. But what you've just said, to be fair, is an interpretation. Going back to an earlier point that I made, which is pretending to apply God's law to all of us is actually applying an interpretation of the words that we've been given so that we understand God's law. And different people have come to different understandings, different interpretations of what those stories mean. And the point that I was making was it's not tenable for someone's interpretation to be adopted by everybody by force and everybody else's interpretation to be rejected. That's just not on.
Well, but at the end of the day, though, Bruce, to be honest, someone will have the interpretation or the application of some worldview or some principle that will be enforced upon people.
Well, but not in the world that I've described.
Well, it's preference. You said it's a matter of
preference.
So that's what I mean. So the case would be if ultimately, and this is really underneath, it's the consent, the authority, really underneath all of it.
Yes.
Is the accounting for how it is that we justify this law, this position, this worldview, this scenario that you've set up.
Yes.
So if it ultimately boils down to preference, let's say, that here's the preference, then the question that I would ask would be, so account for the preference philosophically, account for it evidentially, like why would it be that said preference, for example, would be most supreme if, let's say, the rejection of, let's say, a biblical worldview, or let's say the rejection of God creating people, ultimately, if the belief would be something, and we actually haven't had this discussion, which I would love, not behind microphones, to sit at some point before you head back to Kingston to talk about this, because I would love to hear more about the Bruce. Then I won't share this with anyone, but if the belief is that human beings are the end or the present byproduct of billions of years of natural selection and genetic mutation, leaving the favorable ones, that we've seen in evolution, not just in our bodies, but even in the way we gather together in communities, even moral evolution, right? This is Sam Harris's argument that the evolution, morals, so if all of this is a process of a purely naturalistic or materialistic process.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with that. I certainly do not agree with Sam Harris.
Okay, that's good. I knew I liked you. But if even if we hold to some sort of spiritual reality, whatever that might be, some abstract, it's spiritual in some sense.
Sure.
Even still, we would have to account for why we do what we do. And if the answer is here's said preference, or here's a scenario I'm laying out, and ultimately it's because I think it's to be most preferred, right? It'll yield the greatest amount of freedom. Let's say it'll ultimately yield the greatest freedom by saying if you use force, force is used. Otherwise, don't use force. It'll yield the greatest freedom, and freedom is most preferred, and therefore that's my preference. Why should I or anyone trust that preference or say that's the right way to go? That is the answer, the solution, Why?
Well, there may be several reasons, but the first one I think is because the alternative is violence. Now, if you prefer that, that's your choice.
Yeah. So violence in terms
but
of.
anybody who doesn't, so let me put it this way: anyone who does not prefer violence should prefer this, because this is the only alternative to violence.
Well, there is violence, except in this system, you've consented to it. Therefore,
Sure.
Well, again,
Yes.
within reason, you've consented to it, because
Right.
the person might say,
Right.
"I don't consent to the state violence. I just consent to my own violence."
Sure.
And
Right.
but it's unavoidable that the state will have the sword. There will always be violence.
Yes, there.
Always the sword will always exist to punish
Right.
the lawbreaker. However, we parse that out.
Right. Unless you're in complete anarchy, which is
Which is more violent.
Which is more violent. Right.
Which
Correct.
is far more violent.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But to the question of justification, I mean, philosophically, spiritually, okay, but legally, I don't think so. So let's take free speech for a minute. Okay, so free speech supposed to mean in my books that you can say what you think. Now, there are some limits, like we were talking about earlier,
Threats
of violence.
Yep.
Okay, but otherwise, threats of violence, maybe harassment being that situation where you are imposing your speech in a violent way upon somebody who does not want to hear it.
What about speech that kind of ventures into slander or libel, where you are legitimately harming someone's well-being?
I think there's a case.
Whatever.
As a good example, I think there's a case to make that we shouldn't have defamation laws, but that's a debate. So we'll include it as a possible exception.
I mean more like you're a businessman, you lie to a supplier in order that he undercuts a competitor who now suffers financially because it's a clear lie.
I think it depends upon whether or not through that lie you have breached a contract, a partially executed contract. But let me go through that. Right. So, but if we put those exceptions aside, what is the justification for my free speech? If I'm going to say X or Y, why am I entitled to do that? What's the justification for it?
Great question.
Right?
Yeah.
There isn't one. The only justification is that this is what I think. The way the courts tend to go, and especially the Supreme Court of Canada, they tend to be very utilitarian about it. Like they say, well, what purpose is free speech supposed to serve? Democracy, marketplace of ideas, the seeking of truth, yada, yada, yada. It's like, that is totally wrong in my books. The reason I can say what I think is because that's what I think, period. Because I'm free. If I don't have that ability, if I have to justify why what I said should not be interfered with, then we don't have free speech. That's what free speech means. It's what freedom means.
Well, I guess not justify. I don't mean to justify why, but I would say accounting for why it is that would be preferred. So free speech is a good example.
Okay.
So I believe that the freedom to communicate even detestable, disagreeable things, where it doesn't venture into the realm of threats and harassment, and let's say that fine line where your speech actually harms someone by way of slander or whatever. Let's maybe put that category there.
Let's be clear about this, though. So lots of speech harms other people. The test for free speech is not harm. So if I'm campaigning, if I'm running for an office and I'm campaigning, I'm trying to get the other guy to lose.
Yeah, I say terrible things about Justin Trudeau all the time.
Yeah, harm is not the criteria.
Yeah.
Right?
Right, correct.
Right.
So we have free speech, and at least the framers of the American Constitution, and even I would say our British common law tradition, says that if you silence the ability for someone to criticize the civil government, to bring grievances and redress, and actually be able to speak without their speech being forced, but without their speech being punished, or without having hate speech laws like tamping down on their freedom of speech, that the effect that will have is not only destructive in culture, but again, in my worldview, the way that the world is supposed to function, the way that people are to be held accountable, and the way that people have been given the right to communicate, to defend themselves, to be able to speak freely, is to be protected because, and maybe this is an even deeper discussion about rights, right? So rights, what human beings, the inalienable rights given to human beings, I would say have been given to them, again, by God, who's created the world to operate a certain way. And so the imposition or the squashing of one's rights given to them by God, namely the right, free speech, the ability to criticize the state, the ability to say what I want if it's not committing a crime, as I think we would define crimes a little more. The justification for that ultimately is God, who's created the world to work a certain way. So when I get back to my irreducibly complex point, the justification or the accounting for the laws, the system of governance, is because I would point to God exists. He's made the world to work this way. That'd be my primary thing that I would point to. I could then, after the fact, point to, let's look at the evidence of it as it played out in history, which would be a separate discussion. But at the very least, I would say the accounting is without the reality of a God who is knowable, who is communicated, who actually has order that he's put together in the universe. Without that as a justification, ultimately all human thought, all of our system of governance to account for it is merely just chemical reactions that can't be fully trusted, relied upon, or I think to be held in high regard, because what we're ultimately dealing with are bags of mostly water trying to make sense of the world.
Sure.
And it's just one chemical reaction leading to another. And now I've come up with this law that ultimately there's no way to ground that in absolutes. It can't be. I can't even trust my own thought. I can't trust your thought process.
But
just synapses.
But what you've just described is a perfectly reasonable worldview, like a perfectly reasonable worldview. I have no objections to you holding that view about how the thing works. None at all. None whatsoever. I have a huge objection to you insisting it's the only one to have. It's the only one that has to rule everybody. I don't agree with it. I won't go along with it. I will not be governed by somebody else's view about how God works. So the question, other than just why not, because I know the answer why not. Well, I know how you would, but this is untenable. I don't like this system. So is the only answer to the contrary because it's my preference? Yes.
At the end of the day, it's because of my
value. So the Austrian economists start with a proposition about in their study of economics, which is value is subjective. It's one of the things that makes them different from other economists. Other economists think that the value of a good is the amount of money that it sold for in the marketplace. For the Austrian economists, value is subjective. What you value.
If I'm dying of thirst, I'll pay $100 for that if I need.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But you can extrapolate, in my view, from that proposition in the economic realm into people's thoughts generally. Value is subjective. What you value is completely legitimate, but it's yours. It's not mine. Now, we might have a lot of crossovers. But whether we do or not, it makes no difference because the third person might have no crossovers at all. And all I'm saying is you cannot start with that proposition and say, yeah, but the world works this way, and therefore we're going to do it that way.
So what if, and we talked about this a little bit last time we met, what if I say that nations, cultures, individuals, families, levels of governments over the last 2,000 years that have adopted this worldview and that have imposed laws and had a state structured around this kind of worldview, and the world. Let me specify the worldview. I would specify it. So I would look historically at something like the Glorious Revolution and the Magna Carta. I would look at reformational principles, specifically Calvin and even Luther, when they're looking at the understanding of the state, the role of the state, the function of the human being. I would look at what I think to be the real foundations for both our English common law tradition and the Constitution of the United States, which I think is top to bottom thoroughly based on the scriptures, which is why the 13 colonies had what they did in their constitution. So if that's the foundation, let's look at.
Well, okay, kick around.
Let's look at where that has played out. Let's look at countries. Let's look at families where that worldview has been able to play out. And I would distinguish this from, let's say, the Roman Catholic Holy Roman Empire, which doesn't yield the same results. And then I would say, category 1, countries, states that have adopted this in their laws and institutions. Category 1. Category 2, countries that had it and then let it go into whatever other system. They said, we don't like that anymore. Now we have this, which I think is where we are right now in Canada, to be honest with you. And then the third would be countries that never adopted it, period. When I look at those 3 countries, what it appears to me historically is that category 1 accounts for, and I think this is the irony of the freedom-virtue divide, is I think category 1 ultimately leads, when it comes out in the wash, to the greatest amount of freedom, liberty, elevation out of poverty, protections for women and children, and general prosperity and liberty, which is why non-Christians and people who are not Christians love the idea of living in countries that are grounded in biblical principles, because they actually find it is more freeing there to live in that nation than the Muslim or the atheistic, naturalistic. So if I look at history and I see the effect of the worldview, which is that's not the airtight justification, but when I look at the effects of worldviews as they play out, I see something over history. So is there anything to be said about the effect of the worldview in terms of validating it as being the more preferred worldview in terms of our laws and governance?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I have lots of objections.
Okay.
So the first one is that let's just acknowledge this, and I know you're aware of this, but you've switched tracks completely, right? The argument you just made is a completely consequentialist one.
Right, that's why I said that. Yeah, so I said let's get away from some of the foundational. Let's move into this as well as another argument. Yeah,
exactly.
That's
right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what we're now doing is basically a utilitarian exercise of figuring out what kinds of rules produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, that's one way to go about it, but
because we are dealing with preference, right?
Well, yeah, sure,
but we're dealing with what's preferred.
Yeah, but when you say that, you're essentially making the argument that, well, this works best, right?
Well, or that it would be most preferred.
Or well, okay,
based on results.
Yeah.
We're dealing in the world. We're dealing in the world of results.
Yeah, but that begs the question about what results you're valuing. So, if I were to say, well, what produces the best results, what I would mean is, what system produces the most freedom?
And freedom. So this is something we haven't addressed, and I also didn't hear it. I heard Constantine maybe talk about it.
Yeah.
Define freedom.
Freedom means the absence of restraint, the absence of coercion. That means that you can do anything you want to do, as long as you're not doing the same thing to others.
So that is a kind of so that's freedom, and it's okay. So the absence of restraint,
the absence of coercion. Let's say
the absence of coercion.
Yes. Now
is freedom.
Now here's the distinction that people complain about. Okay, so they might hear absence of restraint and think, well, yeah, but that's not being free. The people who are really free are the people who understand things, who understand discipline, who understand self-imposed restraint, who understand limitations. They are free to live in the world more than other people, because they understand how the world works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the two conflicting conceptions of freedom between the freedom people and the virtue people, and that's because they're talking about two completely different things. The virtue people, when they say to be free, you must understand God. You must understand what it means to be good. You must understand what it means to be virtuous. and to must live your life in accordance with those values. That means you are working towards being free. Okay? Okay. Fine. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking only about the degree to which other people can impose themselves upon you.
So then that definition, other people imposing themselves upon you, what about internal forces of imposition, conscious or subconscious?
Yeah, but you live in the world, and we all have influence over each other. We do from person to person. We do from our culture. We do from our upbringing. We do from our genes. We do from our education. We do from our wealth or lack thereof. We all have an infinite number of influences upon us. So what? I'm talking about, again, the situation where someone comes up to you and says, give me your wallet or I'll stab you through the heart. Or the state says, you can't say that. Those two things are coercion. Everything else is being alive. Okay? So I'm not suggesting in any way that anybody has a pure core of motivation that's not influenced by something. That's not what I mean by freedom. I mean you're not being made by the law, by the police, or by the bully across the street. That's all.
So then so freedom, because freedom as a word is usually, like, what would be the opposite of freedom?
Coercion. If you're being thrown in jail because of what you said, you're being coerced.
So, but that I don't think that would be. Would that be the opposite of freedom, or would that be the imposing on one's freedom? Like, this may be a matter of semantics. When I think free,
yes,
right? If you are usually the opposite of freedom,
yes, is
slavery, or the opposite of freedom would be bound, right? Because coercion. Again, when we're dealing with coercion, we may not be dealing with a literal physical force.
But slavery is a form of coercion.
Right.
Right.
But kind of in terms of definitions, if freedom is not just not to be imposed, say freedom is the ability for me to do whatever I want as long as I'm not imposing and one isn't imposing on me.
Correct.
Would that be a more fleshed out definition?
Yes,
So
except
it's not
that
just for someone.
Except that it does not imply that you should be able to do anything you want to do, in the sense that you might not have resources to do them. Like, so if I'm on the road and I'm driving in my car all day and I want to stay at a really nice 4-star hotel for the night, I don't have the money. Okay, and I have to settle for some roadside motel. Okay, I'm still free. I'm free to do whatever I want. The fact that I don't have the money for my choice
there's an issue of capability or
capability is not part. It's not. That's not part of it.
So freedom is the
it's a lack of coercion.
Yeah, the lack of coercion, but also, so not just the lack of someone imposing on me.
Yeah.
But also for me then to be able to operate in this big sandbox, do whatever I would want to do, so long as the ability's there, because I'm not free to just fly and flap my arms.
Well, right, and you're not free to fly unless you can afford to buy a ticket.
Right. So it's to operate as I want.
Yes.
So long as I'm not imposing on someone.
Yep.
And then to operate as I want, so long as someone isn't imposing upon me.
Correct.
Now, as a definition, or as a way of defining freedom, that definition, as you kind of laid it out, lights went out. Oh, there we go. That kind of definition, as you've laid it out, is that, where would we, how do I say this? Like if I were to look up Merriam-Webster, Oxford, would that be the definition of freedom, or is that a legal definition of freedom? Like that.
Well, I am defining it legally. That's what I mean, right? So this is one of the differences between the virtue people definition and the freedom people definition. The virtue people definition is not a legal definition. It's a philosophical, spiritual, religious definition. How do I become a free individual? I'm not talking about that.
Well, I would say in spiritual freedom, but I think legally, the virtue people would also offer a definition of freedom.
Well, they might,
wouldn't be that.
But I think, and I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I suspect that some of them might say, look, in order to reach that kind of freedom, the law needs to discipline you to stay on the straight and narrow so that you can achieve that kind of freedom. I'm totally opposed to that idea. I'm totally opposed to it because for this reason. So the use of the term virtue people is a kind of ironic thing for me because I don't think that this perspective leads to virtue at all.
By the way, it's a reciprocal irony because I think that
I understand
for freedom,
right.
I would say that actually that again historically, and I think is playing out, leads to the erosion of actual freedom.
Sure.
Than not.
Right.
So I think I found that interesting when I was reading your article. I was like, he would think that that virtue would be an ironic label. And whereas I would also say I think that the virtue people are more concerned with freedom, because I think there's slight difference in definition.
But that's because I'm
not saying the spiritual freedom. I mean, even in the legal realm.
Okay, so in what way am I more free? So let's make it concrete. In what way am I more free if under your regime I am not allowed to hire a prostitute?
Freedom always exists within some sort of boundaries, right?
Okay.
No, but hold on.
Okay.
But it has to exist in some sort of boundaries because even your definition of freedom is the freedom so long as I don't
Okay.
The reality of freedom within boundaries is unavoidable.
Okay.
Right? Do we agree? And that there will always be some bounds. Otherwise there's anarchy, but I would say the irony of anarchy is that's also bounded in that to say there are no rules is a rule. So I think that boundaries are unavoidable.
Okay.
Right? Even if you say there are no rules, that is the rule that there are no rules.
Okay.
So even anarchy has boundaries.
Okay.
Because if someone says this is anarchy, we have,
well, but
I'm
not sure I agree with that about anarchy because anarchy is not a state that everybody agrees to have. It just is, and when you're in it, it means there are no rules. And that's not.
That's the government. That's the one governing
that's not.
rule.
But that's not because I declared it as a rule.
Sure, but philosophically, there's an unspoken rule.
We call it a vacuum. It's not an unspoken rule. It's a vacuum.
But everyone would say if you ask someone, what are the rules? What are the rules for living here? They would say what?
Well, that's like having that's like okay.
They would say there are no rules.
That's like calling zero a number. Okay, zero's a number, but it's the absence of a number of things.
Yeah. So philosophically, there's still something that governs.
Okay, back to the prostitute.
So there's always going to be structure. There's going to be boundaries around however freedom is defined, right?
Okay.
There'll always be some sort of boundary around freedom where it's not just do whatever you want, period.
Okay.
So if there are going to be boundaries around freedom, the question, and this is the disagreement between the freedom people and the virtue people, is who gets to mark the boundaries.
Okay.
So the freedom person says, my preference.
Okay.
Ultimate, if we're boiling all the way down.
Sure. Okay.
My preference gets to define the boundary.
Well, no, that's not the boundary of my freedom. That's the boundary of my behavior. I will behave in the way I prefer. But as far as my freedom,
in terms of this system, of when I asked you, it ultimately went down to that this system is ultimately my preference.
Okay.
So if we boil it down, then it's the preference.
I'm still waiting to hear how my restriction on being able to hire a prostitute is more freedom and not less.
Sure. So if freedom always has boundaries to it, then it's a matter of who gets to define what the boundaries are.
Okay.
And if you define what the boundaries are, you ultimately get to define activity within those boundaries.
Okay.
Right? Because that's your property, right?
Sure.
So in the same way that the person who owns the private road who says to the person, you can't do 200 here, is not imposing on their freedom because their freedom is limited by that.
Right.
God, who gets to define the boundaries. In terms of even laws we need to make, it doesn't make us less free. I'm not less free because I don't get to do 200 on a person's private road.
Oh, actually you are. That's the definition of rights.
But you've said that.
No, if you're in a situation in which freedom is maximized, if you like to put it that way, that means you are able to own property. And part of what comes along with owning property is to be able to determine what happens on the property. But hold on. But this is an important thing. You referred to rights earlier. So let's just define what a legal right is. A legal right is the ability to limit the civil liberties of other people with the help of the state. If you own property, then let's be frank. If you own property, then you are able to limit the civil liberties of other people with respect to their use of that property. No question. And that does not mean, as you have been alluding to, that does not mean that everybody's freedom is absolute. Not true. Because they're limited by the rights of other people. So I'm not ducking that. Absolutely. No question about it. But the fact that if you own property, you are able to limit the civil rights of other people, the fact that you have the freedom to move freely without being coerced is limiting the freedom of the mugger down the street to take you out. That's what I'm talking about, freedom. That's why I defined it as the absence of coercion. It means that you are free to acquire property too, if you want to and if you are able to. Okay? We're all operating in this environment in which we are all free to do these things, and other people are not able to coerce us in the exercise of those rights.
Just after the fact, if we've broken a law, though.
If we violate that principle.
So no one's free to stop me from doing 200 in a school zone.
No, they are if they own the road, because their property rights are limiting your civil liberties.
So my freedoms, but do I have the liberty? Do I actually have the liberty to do 200 on someone's road?
No. Then, if they say no.
So then if I do 200 on someone's private road,
yes,
and I'm stopped or arrested,
yes,
has my freedom been infringed?
Yes, it has. But not through coercion. Well, so I should be careful here. I'm defining freedom as the absence of coercion. You are being coerced in a sense by the state, and the coercion that we are allowing it to impose is the coercion to prevent you from violating the freedom of other people. So here's the equation. If I own a road, then I have the property rights over the road. Therefore, I can define, by definition, what happens on the road. If someone violates those expectations and travels 200 miles an hour, then they are violating my freedom. And therefore, the state is justified in coercing them to stop, right? So, yeah, in a way, we can say that their liberty has been restricted from not being able to drive that fast down the road. But actually, what they've done is violate my freedom. They've coerced me into requiring an activity on my property that I don't allow. That's a violation of my rights.
So, in my worldview, that road, right, is the world.
Yeah, sure.
And that world is...
Well, yeah, but now you are, and maybe you mean to, and fair enough, it would be consistent with the division that you've described, but you are essentially taking ownership of the world.
I'm not.
Well, I know, but you're doing so in the name of a vision that you believe in.
I wouldn't word it that way.
I know you wouldn't,
right.
But I am, because that's
the
description from someone who doesn't share the vision that you're talking about.
Now, but what I would say is the accounting for said vision or worldview and the defense of the presuppositions that undergird it, I would say can be not only justified within my worldview.
But that's the key, though. That's
be accounted for.
Yeah, but hold on. Those are the key words. Those are the key words within your worldview. They absolutely can be justified. Absolutely. The thing is coherent inside. Outside, it's not at all.
But it's the only coherent.
Not true.
I would say that ultimately it is the only one that justifies itself in a consistent
saying
way.
That doesn't make it so.
Well, but I wouldn't just say that. So
I know, but those people who come along, even after hearing the proof, say, well, I hear you, but I don't agree. The only way to bring them over, apparently, is with force, which is my central point. Mm-hmm. The people who believe in this vision, at the end of the day, are using nothing but force to insist that everybody live this way.
Well, but again, respectfully, your worldview does the same. You would just say it does it in a more preferred way, because ultimately,
sure.
So that's unavoidable.
Well, what I'm preventing you from doing, if I can put it this way, the only thing that I'm preventing you from doing is coercing other people.
The only thing
that I am preventing you from doing, or would like to prevent you from doing, is coercing other people.
Well, but
because in my world, everything that you have said and everything that you believe is completely legitimate in terms of how you operate your life and your family and your marriage and your kids and your church and your business. Everything is fine. The only thing that my worldview prevents you from doing is imposing that on everybody else who does not agree with it.
By imposing it upon me.
By imposing it upon you.
Well, so the worldview.
Yes.
That is preventing me.
Yes.
From imposing my worldview on others.
Yes.
By imposing a worldview on me.
Yes. Correct.
So it's
right, but
so the matters of preference are different, but ultimately we're dealing in the same kind of world.
You can put it that way, but let's not. I don't want you to wriggle out from reality, which is that the violence is on your side and not mine.
Okay.
Right. In this sense. So I'm
the state enforcing.
The state enforcing, right? You want to use state force to make sure that I don't hire a prostitute in my home who has come and freely consented to the transaction, right? You have said you two people alone are not allowed to do that. And to make sure you don't, we're going to use force. And that's all there is to it. I don't care what your justifications are. I don't care what the philosophy is.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you in partnership with Liberty Coalition Canada and Christian Week, and has been produced by SDG Media. You can find all things Liberty Coalition Canada at libertycoalitioncanada.com.